What am I looking at? No, that can't be real. Those eyes, red, watching me. Is that a Wendigo?
They said the wind could speak in the northern forests, not in words but in cries, long, hollow, and laced with hunger. The trappers didn't talk about it around fires, and the missionaries dared not name it aloud. But the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Algonquin, they had always known. It moved through snow-laden pines on the coldest nights, searching for flesh, for weakness, for the souls of those who'd strayed too far into the silence. In the long winters of the 19th century, when starvation gripped the land like a vice and isolation twisted men's minds, stories began to surface of hunters who vanished and returned different, of men who devoured their kin not just from desperation but from desire. They called it Witikau, the Wendigo. And in the frost-bitten wilds of Canada, the legend was more than a tale. It was a warning. The past doesn't sleep. It lingers. In ash and iron, in whispers behind ruined walls, buried in silence, are stories left untold, echoes of those who vanished, voices lost to time. But the archive remembers. This is where history breathes again. This is archived stories, because some stories were never meant to be forgotten. The winter of 1878 was one of the cruelest the Northern Territories had ever seen. Temperatures plunged well below freezing for weeks at a time, and snow blanketed the vast Canadian shield like a white tomb. In the boreal forests north of Fort Vermilion, deep within what is now northern Alberta, settlers and indigenous communities alike spoke of strange things stirring in the cold. The pines stood silent most days, their limbs heavy with snow, but at night they seemed to murmur. Trees creaked with a rhythm that sounded more like breathing than bending. Even the wolves, those eternal companions of the dark, had gone quiet. In the logging camp at Deep Lake, a remote outpost composed of no more than 7 cabins and a storage shack, men whispered about the wind's voice. Hardened Métis hunters and Scottish trappers alike found their sleep broken by strange cries. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a man. It was something in between. One evening, as the last violet light slipped behind the tree line, Thomas McLaren, a foreman from Montreal, stood near the fire sharpening his axe. He was not a superstitious man. He had built rail lines across the Laurentians and felled trees in Nova Scotia's deepest woods. But here, in this frozen cradle of wilderness, something gnawed at his instincts, something ancient and unknowable. He turned to his colleague, a Saulteaux man named Eli Stonechild, who was staring intently into the trees beyond the camp. "You hear it again?" Thomas asked. Eli didn't answer right away. His breath hung in the air like smoke, and when he finally spoke, it was low, barely more than a whisper. "Something's walking between the trees, long legs, too tall, watching." Thomas tried to laugh, but the sound fell flat. "You're seeing shadows, Eli. Wind plays tricks on tired eyes." Eli finally looked at him. "This is not a place for laughing." Later that night, as frost clawed at the windows and the fire began to die down, a scream pierced the silence. Not a human scream, something higher, shriller, like sinew snapping under pressure. The men poured out of their cabins with rifles in hand, scanning the trees with oil lanterns, hearts pounding. They found nothing. No tracks in the snow, no sign of an animal. But something had changed in the air. A weight had settled over the camp like a low mist, silent, heavy, and suffocating. That night, one of the loggers, a quiet man named Jules Roche, disappeared. His cabin door was open, swinging on its hinge. His boots were still by the fire, and his coat hung on its peg. No one heard him leave, and no one saw him return. In the morning, they found something strange. Claw marks gouged into the wood just outside his door, deep and inhuman. And beneath them, a line of melted snow that led into the woods, as if something hot, feverishly hot, had passed through in the dead of night. The men gathered that morning, pale and sleepless. No one said it out loud, but the word hung in the back of their minds like a spectre. Wendigo. He arrived frostbitten and breathless, speaking in broken, urgent tones to the factor in charge, Robert Hayward. Hayward was a man of order. Educated in England, he had spent the last decade navigating the harsh trade routes of the North, a ledger book always close at hand. Superstition to him belonged in fireside tales and the drunken ramblings of voyageurs. But there was something in Misko's eyes, something terrified and unshakable, that made him pause. "The spirit of the starving forest," Misko said in his native tongue, translated slowly through one of the Métis clerks. "It walks in the skin of a man, but carries the hunger of death." Hayward frowned. "You're saying something is hunting them?" Misko nodded. "Not something, someone. Taken, twisted." Despite his doubts, Hayward dispatched a small party northward to Deep Lake. 2 Hudson's Bay men, 1 Cree guide, and a missionary named Father Delacour, who insisted on accompanying them. Delacour had long worked among the local tribes and knew of the Witikau. He had written it off as allegory, until now. The party arrived 4 days later to find the camp in disarray. One of the cabins had been burned to the ground, blackened skeletons of beams poking into the sky like broken fingers. The men, now down to 4 from the original 7, looked emaciated and haunted. Thomas McLaren was there, face hollow, eyes darting. "They tried to bury it," he muttered, gesturing toward a hastily dug pit near the tree line. "Whatever took Jules, it came back. Took another. We tried fire." Father Delacour approached the pit. Inside, half covered in snow, lay the charred remains of something vaguely human. The limbs were elongated, the rib cage grotesquely stretched, and the mouth, what was left of it, frozen in a snarl. The priest stepped back, making the sign of the cross. That night, as snow fell in thick, silent curtains, Hayward sat in the surviving cabin, writing his report by lantern light. Eli Stonechild sat across from him, staring into the flames. "You still don't believe," Eli said quietly. "I believe something dangerous is out there," Hayward replied. "But monsters, spirits?" Eli's face didn't change. "You think hunger is just in the belly. You're wrong. It can live in a man's heart, in his bones. When he feeds it, when he gives in, it changes him. The old ones say the Wendigo was once a hunter who ate his brother to survive the winter. The hunger never left." A scream tore through the night. The men burst outside, rifles raised, snowflakes twisted in the wind like ash. At the edge of the tree line stood a figure, bare, gaunt, impossibly tall. Its limbs bent wrong, its eyes glowed faintly in the dark. And its breath came in clouds of steam that curled like smoke. Then it vanished, as though the forest itself had swallowed it. The Cree guide dropped his lantern and whispered in terror, Wendigo! No one slept that night, and in the morning the forest was quiet, too quiet. The tracks were gone. The pit had been disturbed, and Father Delacour's cross, which he had left on the burned remains, now lay bent and blackened in the snow. The wind had changed. It came shrieking through the trees like a living thing. No longer the dull howl of winter, but a sharp, slicing voice that rattled bones and stirred unease. To the men of the camp, it no longer carried cold, it carried intent. It was as if the forest itself had begun to speak in its own cruel language. Thomas McLaren stood at the edge of the clearing, coat drawn tight against his chest, staring at the distant line of black pines. The sky was the color of ash, and though it was midday, there was barely any light. Everything felt wrong. Days no longer passed. They dragged, distorted, stretched like time had begun to warp. The Wendigo, he now believed, was not just a creature, it was a presence, a force. By the second morning after the sighting, the missionary, Father Delacour, had stopped speaking altogether. He simply clutched his Bible and stared blankly at the forest, lips moving silently. That evening, he built a crude altar out of firewood, antlers, and ashes from the burned cabin. He placed the bent crucifix at its center, whispered a prayer, and left it facing the pines. At night, the wind answered. It wasn't just the screams anymore. There were voices, recognizable voices, ones the men knew. Thomas swore he heard Jules Roche calling for help. One of the other trappers insisted he heard his mother weeping in French. The guide, Misco, woke up screaming, crying out in Cree for his dead brother. But worst of all were the shadows, shapes glimpsed just beyond the firelight, always tall, always watching. On the fourth night, the wind began to shift again, carrying the heavy stench of rot. Hayward, who had still clung to rationality like a cloak, finally lost his composure when they found what remained of the guide. Misco had left his tent during the night. No one heard him go. In the morning, his body was found half a mile from camp, impaled high in the branches of a spruce like a warning. His chest was torn open. His heart was gone. Eli Stonechild refused to bury him. "He fed the forest," he said. "Now the forest will carry him." Hayward snapped. "You call this wisdom? You call this order? There's no reason left in this hell?" Eli turned to him, his face calm. "There's no room for reason in a place the Wendigo walks. Only survival and silence." The storm worsened. That night, as fire crackled low and nerves frayed thin, Thomas sat awake. He had not slept in days. He fingered the blade of his axe. The hunger was real now, not the ordinary pangs of missing a meal, but something primal, gnawing, hollowing him out from the inside. He had watched the food stores dwindle, and the meat turn rancid. His breath steamed in front of him, and his hands trembled. Then came the whisper. "Take," it said. "Feed. Survive." He turned, startled, but there was no one, just the wind, seeping through the walls like a spirit looking for flesh. Outside, the pines swayed violently, though there was no breeze. The shadows moved again, and for the first time Thomas was unsure if they were just watching or waiting. The Hudson's Bay men left the Deep Lake camp by the end of January. 2 of them didn't survive the return journey. Father Delacour never made it home. His journal, found months later beneath the roots of a fallen tree, ended with a single line scratched into the last page. "The soul rots before the flesh." Back at Fort St. Albert, Robert Hayward attempted to document everything he had seen, but his words came slowly, uncertainly, as if the horror resisted language. The report he sent to the company's higher offices was clinical. Sterile, missing men, unexplained deaths, severe weather conditions, not a word of the Wendigo. But the fear lingered, and then, not a year later, a case emerged that brought the legend out of the shadows and into the halls of Canadian justice. Swift Runner, a Cree man known to the whites by that name, had once been a respected guide and a devout convert to Christianity. He lived with his wife, 6 children, mother-in-law, and brother in a cabin just 40 miles northeast of Edmonton. He had worked for the mounted police as a scout, but in the winter of 1878 to 79, the same winter as the Deep Lake horror, Swift Runner stumbled into a trading post alone, gaunt and wild-eyed. He claimed his family had starved. The officers were skeptical. He looked too healthy for a man who had survived a famine. Suspicion turned to horror when they followed him back to his cabin. What they found chilled even the most hardened of men. Bones, human bones, littered the property. Some snapped open and hollowed for marrow. A pot over the fire still held cooked remains. Skulls of children, cracked and blackened. Evidence showed that Swift Runner had not only killed his entire family, he had eaten them piece by piece. At his trial in Fort Saskatchewan, he did not deny the acts. In fact, he seemed lucid, almost relieved to confess. He claimed he had been possessed by a Wendigo spirit, that it crept into his dreams, whispering of hunger, that it twisted his heart and turned the faces of his family into flesh he could no longer resist. The court tried him for murder, not madness. On December 20th, 1879, Swift Runner was hanged, the first legal execution in Alberta. Before his death, he reportedly asked the jailers if the noose would quiet the creature inside him. To the settlers, it was a case of insanity, a man broken by isolation and winter. To the Cree, it was a cautionary tale, an old truth resurfacing in new times. News of the case spread across Canada. Some dismissed it as myth clinging to the bones of tragedy, but others, those who had seen the forest under moonlight, who had heard the whispers in the trees, knew better. The Wendigo was not just a legend, it was a hunger with a name, and once it chose a host, it did not leave quietly. February gripped the land with iron fingers. At Deep Lake, the last of the original loggers had vanished into the woods or died in their cabins. The site was later declared cursed by local trappers and Cree elders alike, left abandoned to rot beneath the snow. Trees crept slowly back toward the edges of the clearing, reclaiming what man had touched. Fires no longer burned there, only silence remained. But the Wendigo did not die with the men it consumed. Reports filtered through northern Ontario that same year of a tall, skeletal figure stalking a small missionary outpost near Lake Nipigon. A nun, Sister Angele, claimed to have seen it one night from her window. Gaunt, over 7 feet tall, with eyes that flickered like embers. She said it paused at the tree line and stared at her without blinking until morning. By the end of the week, 2 local children went missing. Only bloodied footprints were found, leading into the trees, and then nothing. Back in Fort St. Albert, Eli Stonechild lived alone, deep in the bush. He no longer spoke to company men or ventured into town. He built a new lodge, low to the ground, circular in shape, covered in cedar branches. Inside, he kept no iron tools, only bone knives and smudge bundles of sage, sweetgrass, and tobacco. He believed these would keep the Wendigo at bay. but even he knew it could not be held off forever. "The Wendigo is not a beast," he told a passing Cree youth who sought wisdom from him. "It's a mirror. When you look into it, you see what you'll do when the cold gets deep and the meat runs out." Others weren't so poetic. One fur trapper, Jacques Lemay, was found staggering along the Athabasca River, clothes torn and eyes white with terror. He had spent the winter alone in a cabin with another man, his partner, Remy. Lemay claimed Remy had grown strange by January, whispered to himself, stared at the fire too long. One night, he left the cabin and came back, changed. Lemay locked him out, but said Remy clawed at the walls all night, muttering in voices that didn't sound like his own. When the sun rose, he was gone, and so was the meat. Lemay never returned to the forest. Even the mounted police, though skeptical, began keeping quiet records of unusual disappearances in the north. One file, dated 1882, simply read, "Camp found abandoned. All occupants presumed dead. Fire still warm, no signs of struggle. Tree bark clawed 8 feet high." The stories piled up, too many to ignore, and through them all ran a consistent thread: starvation, isolation, madness, and something just out of sight. Those who lived through the winters and returned spoke little, but their eyes always told the truth, wide and glassy, watching the corners of the room, watching the woods, and always listening for that faint whistle of wind, that whisper just beneath the cold, the sound of flesh and shadows moving through the pines. By the turn of the 20th century, settlers had pushed deeper into the Canadian interior, carving towns into wilderness that once belonged only to trees, rivers, and legends. Railroads cut through the forests, telegraph wires hummed above the snow, and with them came a new arrogance that the old world had been tamed. But the elders knew better. Among the Cree, the Algonquin, the Ojibwe, those whose ancestors had walked the boreal lands long before the first fur trader ever arrived, the warnings never ceased. The stories were passed not for fear, but for survival. Never wander too far alone. Never let hunger twist your thoughts. And never forget that the Wendigo is not a creature of the flesh. It is a hunger of the soul. One such elder, Niska, had lived long enough to see the land change beneath her feet. Born in 1839 near the shores of Lake Abitibi, she had outlived her children and seen her grandchildren taken by boarding schools. But she remained in her people's land, and she remembered. She spoke of the Wendigo not as myth, but as memory. "There was a winter when 5 boys went missing from the edge of our village," she told a young archivist from the Department of Indian Affairs in 1912. "The snow had swallowed the sun and men were starving. One came back alone, eyes black, skin tight on the skull. He said they froze, but the elders found blood on his breath. He was sent into the forest to walk until the spirit took him. That is how we cleanse it. That is how we bury the Wendigo." The archivist, a skeptic from Ottawa, wrote it down as folklore, yet never returned for a second interview. His journal entry stopped mid-page, with only a final sentence scrawled across the margin. "She wasn't telling me a story. She was giving a warning." Across the north, stories continued to surface. A group of railway workers near Chapleau disappeared for 3 days during a blizzard. When they returned, one man was missing. The others said he had wandered off, but they never spoke of it again. The foreman who reported the event later went mad, confined to a Montreal asylum, muttering about a voice in the wind that had never been human. In Lac Seul, a hunting party returned with no meat but full bellies. The elders questioned them. Days later they were gone, vanished without tracks. Only a smear of black ash was left at their last campsite. For those who still lived close to the old ways, there was no surprise, no disbelief, only respect for the unseen. The Wendigo had not died. It had simply adapted. No longer confined to the woods, it now walked alongside the lonely, the desperate, the broken. Anywhere hunger could live. It needed no claws, no antlers, just a whisper in the cold and a soul with space to rot. And still the elders warned, the Wendigo is not just out there, it is in here, waiting for the winter inside us to begin.